When the doorbell rang that morning, I almost didn't answer it. I had been enjoying my coffee, sunlight spilling across the kitchen table, thinking about how quiet life had become. But then I saw them through the glass, their silhouettes on the porch, and my heart stopped. My son Ryan, the boy who hadn't spoken to me in 13 years, stood there with his wife, Jenna, each of them holding designer luggage, like they were checking into a hotel. For a moment, the world tilted. It was strange how quickly the past could step right up to your door, dressed in expensive shoes and forced smiles. 13 years of silence. And now here they were. On the very day the town paper had printed the story about my lottery win, I didn't need to ask why they came. I already knew. I remember opening the door slowly, my mind running ahead of my heartbeat. I thought, is this what it takes for a son to come home? A few lucky numbers and a new house with more space than one woman needs, but I smiled steady, polite, and told myself to breathe. I wasn't that desperate woman they had walked away from more than a decade ago. Not anymore. I had built a life out of quiet mornings, out of peace that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Still, as I looked into Ryan's eyes, part of me wondered if he saw the same woman he had once dismissed as a burden. Or did he see the headline version of me, the newly minted millionaire mother, and smell opportunity instead of love? The air between us carried all the words we hadn't said in years. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I'd been. And maybe I didn't expect him to. I simply stepped aside, letting the past cross my threshold. I didn't know then that this visit would test every boundary I had learned to build. I only knew one thing this time. I would not be the one left broken when the door closed again. And that's how it began, the morning my son returned. Not for family, but for fortune. After they stepped inside, time folded in on itself. The sound of their suitcases against the floor felt louder than it should have, echoing through the house I'd built alone. It made me think about all the years that had filled the empty spaces between us, 13 long years of birthdays missed, holidays spent in silence, and letters never sent. People often say time heals everything, but they forget to mention that time also teaches. Those first few years after Ryan cut me off were brutal. I kept asking myself what kind of mother loses her only son to pride. I replayed our last argument until the words blurred together. Back then, I thought if I'd just said the right thing, maybe he wouldn't have walked away. But as months turned to years, something inside me began to shift. I stopped waiting by the phone. I stopped checking old photos like they were proof of who I used to be. I enrolled in a community class, first in financial literacy, then in home gardening. I met people who didn't know my history. People who saw me as more than a mistake, someone else abandoned. There were lonely nights. Of course, nights when the silence felt like a punishment for loving too hard. But somewhere along the way, I realized that love without self-respect isn't love at all. It's fear dressed up in devotion. When the lottery numbers changed my circumstances, I wasn't chasing luxury, I was chasing stability. For the first time, I felt secure. I had savings, plans, and a small but loyal circle of friends who cared for me without conditions. And now, as I watched Ryan and Jenna stand in my living room, surrounded by the comfort I'd built from the ashes of old heartbreak, I couldn't help but wonder, did they see the woman who had learned to stand alone? Or the mother they thought would always let them back in? I didn't have the answer yet. But deep down, I had a feeling I was about to find out. I remember watching Ryan and Jenna wheel their suitcases into the house like they already belonged there. The way their eyes moved told me everything, counting rooms, estimating value, mentally claiming space that wasn't theirs. I stood still, letting the weight of that moment settle in my chest. This was my home. Every inch of it built from hard lessons and quiet resilience. There was a strange calm that came over me, the kind that only shows up when you've already lived through worse. I told myself to observe before reacting, to listen not just to their words, but to what sat behind them. 13 years ago, I would have rushed to please, desperate to be loved. Now, I only felt curiosity and a little sorrow. As they moved deeper into the house, I could see how carefully Jenna's eyes lingered on the decor, how Ryan's fingers brushed the edges of furniture like he was taking inventory. I wondered if they saw the framed photos on the wall, the ones from before everything fell apart, or if those memories had been replaced by something colder, more practical. Inside, a quiet conversation ran between my heart and my mind. My heart whispered, "They came back. Maybe they missed you." But my mind answered, "Or maybe they just missed what you now have." I invited them to sit in the living room. The same room where, years ago, I'd once watched my son walk out for good. The irony wasn't lost on me. Back then, I had begged him to stay, my voice breaking under the weight of love and rejection. This time, I simply sat across from them, steady and polite, with my coffee in hand. The air carried a brittle politeness. I could feel them searching for the right tone, trying to sound caring while circling around whatever they'd come to ask. Every word felt rehearsed, every smile calculated. And yet, I stayed still, letting them speak, because I already knew what was coming. When you've been abandoned once, you learn to recognize the scent of entitlement long before it's spoken aloud. As Ryan began to talk about family, about reconnecting, I found myself studying his face not for the son I remembered, but for the man he'd become. Somewhere along the line, love had turned into transaction for him. Maybe life had hardened him. Or maybe greed had just found a comfortable home in his heart. And yet, I didn't feel anger, not yet. What I felt was clarity. I had spent too many years wondering what I'd done wrong. Now, watching them sitting on my couch with their perfect posture and empty words, I realized the answer had never been about me. Still, I played along. Sometimes silence reveals more than confrontation ever could. And as I watched their confidence start to waver, I knew the moment of truth was coming soon. There comes a point in every conversation when pretense starts to crack. For me, it was when Ryan's voice softened, and Jenna leaned forward like she was about to make an offer wrapped in concern. I could almost feel their words reaching for my wallet before they ever reached my heart. That's when I decided it was time. I placed my coffee down and reached for the folder on the side table, the one I'd prepared weeks earlier. Almost on instinct, something in me had known this moment would come. I had learned to listen to those quiet, protective instincts. They rarely lied. Inside that folder was more than paper. It was proof. Bank records, credit reports, notes from a private investigator I'd hired after my name started making its way around Maple Ridge. I had done what any woman with new money and old scars would do. I protected myself. As I opened the folder, I could almost hear the air shift. Every detail was there: 3 maxed-out credit cards, a second mortgage, a business that hadn't had a real client in 8 months. Their so-called consulting firm was a facade built on borrowed money and empty promises. In the past, that knowledge would have broken my heart. But now, it only steadied me. For the first time, I wasn't reacting from pain, I was responding from strength. I didn't have to raise my voice or call them out directly. I simply laid the papers on the coffee table, the sound of the folder hitting wood echoing louder than any argument ever could. I could feel their panic before they spoke. The way guilt always exposes itself through silence. I thought about the years I'd spent being the one who apologized, the one who explained, the one who bent until I nearly disappeared. That woman was gone. The woman sitting here now had done her homework. And in that moment, I didn't feel vindictive. I felt free. Because I realized that boundaries aren't about shutting people out, they're about deciding who's earned the right to stay in. I looked at Ryan and Jenna, and for the first time since they'd arrived, they had nothing rehearsed to offer. The air between us turned still, like a storm waiting to break. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Sometimes truth doesn't need an announcement, it just needs to be seen. And I knew this was only the beginning. The real reason behind their return hadn't even surfaced yet. As I sat across from them, watching the color drain from their faces, I thought back to the last conversation Ryan and I ever had 13 years ago. For years, I believed the distance between us came from misunderstanding. Maybe I had embarrassed him. Maybe I'd said something wrong. But the truth, when it finally revealed itself, was far uglier than I'd imagined. It hadn't been about me being overbearing or outdated. It had been about money that never existed. Back then, Ryan and Jenna were chasing an illusion. They had convinced themselves that a wealthy uncle from my late husband's side would leave them a large inheritance if they proved they could stand on their own. To do that, they needed to cut me out completely, to appear independent and successful. I didn't know any of this at the time. I just knew that my calls went unanswered. My letters came back unopened. And my love seemed to make them uncomfortable. I spent years punishing myself for mistakes I never made. But as I pieced the truth together over time through mutual friends, through quiet whispers at church or the grocery store, I saw it clearly. They had turned away, not out of pain, but out of calculation. And the saddest part was that their plan never worked. The uncle they had pinned their hopes on saw through them long before the rest of us did. He left every penny of his fortune to an animal shelter, saying something about how real wealth belonged to those who cared for others, not those who abandoned them. When I learned that, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt grief. Grief for the son who thought pretending not to need me was the key to his future. Grief for the woman he married, who measured worth in assets instead of affection. Now, seeing them back in my living room, their so-called independence buried under debt, I couldn't help but think of the irony. The inheritance they had traded me for had vanished. And here they were, back at my door. Not because of love, but because of the same hunger that had driven them away. It hit me that some lessons don't arrive wrapped in punishment, they arrive as opportunities to prove who you've become. 13 years ago, I would have begged for reconciliation. Now, I simply waited for honesty. And deep down, I knew we weren't done yet. There was still another truth waiting to come out, one that would test just how much forgiveness I was capable of. The longer we sat in that room, the more I realized something had changed, not in them, but in me. For the first time since Ryan was born, I wasn't trying to fix things. I wasn't trying to earn love or soften the truth. I was simply holding my ground, and it felt powerful in a way I had never known. Ryan sat there avoiding my eyes, and Jenna tried to fill the silence with small talk that didn't land anywhere. I could see her discomfort every time she looked around. Like she was searching for a version of me she could still manipulate. But that woman no longer lived here. In that moment, I understood something I wish I'd known years ago. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. And I had surrendered for too long. I thought back to the night Ryan told me I was holding him back. That his future would shine brighter without the weight of my mistakes. I'd carried those words like stones in my chest for over a decade. But sitting here, surrounded by proof of how far I'd come, I realized I had turned those stones into the foundation of a life I was proud of. I looked at them both. Not with anger, but with calm awareness. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. And I knew it was time to break it. But instead of reaching for reconciliation, I reached for truth. I told myself that honesty was the only gift worth giving, now the kind that liberates rather than pleases. And as I prepared to show them the final piece of what I knew, I could almost feel the power in the room shift completely. For the first time, I wasn't the one afraid of what came next. They were. What they didn't realize was that the story wasn't finished, not even close. There was still a storm waiting behind that calm. I remember the sound of the grandfather clock that afternoon. Each tick felt louder than the one before. Like time itself was holding its breath. I had kept a letter tucked away in my desk drawer for weeks. unopened at first, because I wasn't ready for what it might mean. But that day, sitting across from Ryan and Jenna, I knew it was time. The envelope had come from a law office in Denver. Clean, professional, and heavy with consequence. It carried the name Marcus Cole, Ryan's former business partner, the same man they had once claimed betrayed them. When I first received it, I'd thought it was some leftover business matter that didn't concern me. But curiosity can be a dangerous thing. And once I read it, everything changed. Marcus had written through his attorney, explaining that after an audit, he discovered that $50,000 had disappeared from the company account just before the business dissolved. He had evidence, statements, and a pending file with the district attorney's office. What struck me most was how calm the letter sounded, measured, factual, and final. It ended with one clear line: Ryan and Jenna had until 5 o'clock in the evening to contact his attorney and arrange repayment before the case moved forward to criminal charges. As I sat there with them, the letter in my hands, I couldn't help thinking about how choices have a way of circling back. You can run from consequences, but they always know where you live. I didn't read the letter aloud. I didn't need to. I simply placed it on the coffee table next to the folder of debts. And I watched their faces. Shock, fear, denial. All of it passed through them like a storm no one had prepared for. In the silence that followed, I found an odd sense of peace. I had spent years wishing for an apology, or maybe some sign that they understood what they'd done to me. But as I watched them now, I realized I didn't need their remorse to move on. I already had what I came for: clarity. The truth is, the letter wasn't just about Marcus or money. It was about accountability. Life was finally giving them a mirror, and I was done shielding them from their reflection. I let the clock keep ticking. Every second closer to 5 o'clock reminded me that some deadlines are merciful, and some are merciless. And maybe this one was a little of both. When the truth finally sat between us, I could feel the weight of it pressing into the air. Ryan looked lost, and Jenna's composure had cracked. They weren't ready for accountability, they were still hoping for rescue. But I had spent too many years cleaning up other people's messes to become their safety net again. I told myself that love and rescue are not the same thing. Love lifts, but rescue can cripple when it comes too easily. I had to decide what kind of mother I wanted to be in that moment, the one who keeps bailing her son out, or the one who finally teaches him what real responsibility looks like. So I set my terms. Not out of revenge, but out of mercy wrapped in truth. If they truly wanted help, I would give them one last chance. But only through structure, not sentiment. I offered them a single loan of $25,000, just enough to hire a defense attorney and enroll in a legitimate debt counseling program. Not enough to erase their mistakes, just enough to start rebuilding. But there were conditions, firm and non-negotiable. They would both have to enter therapy. Separately, not together. They needed to understand how deceit had become second nature in their marriage. They would also need to make restitution every dollar they'd taken from family, from friends, from Marcus, and most of all, they would have to work. Real jobs. Steady ones. The kind that make you earn your piece dollar by dollar instead of scheming your way to it. I made it clear that this wasn't about control. It was about boundaries, about showing them that compassion doesn't mean surrender. If they couldn't accept those conditions, they would walk out of my house with nothing but the consequences they'd already earned. There was no anger in me as I said it. Only certainty. The kind that comes when you've been through enough pain to finally know your worth. I thought about how easy it would have been to hand over the money just to make the problem disappear. To keep pretending everything was fine. But that would have been the old me, the woman who confused forgiveness with permission. This time, forgiveness had rules. I knew it would hurt them to hear those boundaries spoken out loud. But maybe pain was the only teacher left that could reach them. And as the clock kept ticking toward 5 o'clock, I could see it in their faces. They were realizing that the life they'd built on shortcuts had finally reached its limit. As the words settled in the air, the house grew quiet again, quiet in that heavy way where even the smallest sound feels too loud. I could see Ryan wrestling with himself. The way his eyes darted toward the floor, then back at me, searching for a place to start. For the first time since he'd walked through my door, he looked like my son again, not the man chasing status or excuses, but the boy who used to sneak into my room after nightmares just to feel safe. He finally spoke, though not with the confidence he used to wear, like armor. His voice was low, broken in a way that told me this was no longer about manipulation. It was about release. He admitted that if I hadn't won the lottery, he never would have called. He said pride had become a wall so tall he couldn't see over it, and shame had chained him to silence for too long. Those words hurt. Not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. After 13 years of pretending I didn't care, I felt the sting of love again, raw, imperfect, and real. For the first time, I saw the fear behind his arrogance, the regret behind his distance. I didn't cry. Not then. My tears had already been spent years ago. But something in me softened. I realized that sometimes people return not because they deserve forgiveness, but because they finally understand the weight of what they've done. That moment didn't erase the past, but it cracked open a door to something new, accountability, maybe even healing. Still, forgiveness wasn't a gift I could hand out like money. It had to mean something. It had to cost something. I told myself that when the morning came, if he truly meant what he said, he'd prove it. Words alone wouldn't be enough. And as I looked at Ryan sitting there smaller somehow, quieter, I knew the night wasn't over yet. But the worst of the storm had passed. And for the first time, there was a trace of light. The next morning came early. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my coffee cooling beside me as sunlight crept through the curtains. It was one of those mornings that felt both peaceful and heavy. The kind where clarity comes at a price. At exactly 8:47 in the morning, the phone rang. My heart already knew who it was. Ryan's voice sounded tired, like someone who hadn't slept all night. He said they accepted every condition: the therapy, the restitution, the jobs, all of it. There was no bargaining this time. No pretense. Just resignation, and something softer beneath it. Maybe hope. I listened quietly, letting his words fall into the quiet spaces of the room. A part of me wanted to believe him, to grab onto that flicker of sincerity and call it redemption. But another part, the wiser part, knew better. Change doesn't come through promises made over the phone. It comes through action that survives the test of time. When he finished speaking, I took a breath before answering. Forgiveness, I told myself, was something I could give freely, but trust that had to be earned back. Day by day, I forgave him not because he deserved it, but because I needed peace more than I needed revenge. Letting go wasn't easy. 13 years of anger doesn't dissolve overnight. But I realized that holding on to pain only kept me tethered to the person I used to be. Forgiveness, in that moment, wasn't about Ryan, it was about freeing myself. Still, I made it clear. Even if only in my own heart, forgiveness doesn't mean access. He would have to prove, through consistency and humility, that he understood the difference. When I hung up, I stared out at the garden I'd built with my own hands. The same soil that once felt empty now carried life again. It reminded me that healing doesn't happen all at once. It grows quietly, beneath the surface. Until one day you realize the hurt no longer owns you. I didn't know what the coming months would bring. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: love without limits had nearly destroyed me once. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. The morning after that phone call felt strangely calm. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from happiness, it was the quiet that follows a storm. I could almost feel the air resetting, like life was giving all of us one last chance to start again. Ryan and Jenna showed up later that day to collect the information they'd need. There were no smiles. No small talk. Just a quiet acceptance of the road ahead. I handed them a folder with the contact details for a bankruptcy attorney and a debt counselor. It wasn't much, but it was a map out of the hole they'd dug for themselves. Whether they'd climb out or not, that was up to them. As I watched them walk to their car, I didn't feel anger or pity. What I felt was something new: relief. They were finally carrying their own weight. And for the first time in years, I wasn't holding it for them. Later that morning, around 8:47, I got a call from the attorney's office confirming they had reached out. I sat in silence for a long time, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of birds outside my kitchen window. I realized how precious peace can feel when you've lived too long in chaos. That day, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would help them only once. No more rescues. No more sacrifices that left me empty. From here on out, my love would have boundaries, and my compassion would have structure. It wasn't easy, knowing my son was struggling, but letting him face his consequences wasn't cruelty. It was the most honest form of love I could give. Because real growth never happens in comfort. It happens when life strips you bare and makes you rebuild piece by piece. As the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, I found myself whispering a prayer, not for their success, but for their strength. If they truly meant to change, they would need more than luck this time. They'd need endurance. The weeks that followed felt like watching a wound begin to heal slow, painful, and uncertain. Ryan and Jenna had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long. They started therapy, just like I'd required. Though I knew that admitting their flaws would be far harder than paying back money. Ryan took a job at a local construction company. Manual labor. Honest work. The kind that leaves you sore but also reminds you that you're building something real. I remember thinking how poetic it was, that after years of building illusions, he was finally building something solid with his hands. Jenna, on the other hand, found work at a small cafe in town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. She told me later, through an awkward phone call, that learning to earn a paycheck on her own had changed something in her. She'd always believed success had to look shiny. But for the first time, she said, she understood what peace felt like. They began paying back what they owed, a little at a time. Sometimes they'd send me updates, short messages. Practical. Polite. There was no emotional language. But the consistency spoke louder than any apology could. I didn't respond much. I wanted them to have the space to grow without leaning on me for validation. And still, late at night, I would think about them. I'd picture Ryan driving home after a long shift. Dirt on his hands, but dignity in his chest. I'd picture Jenna counting her tips. Tired, but proud. Those images comforted me more than any words ever could. There was a strange balance forming between us, distance filled not with resentment, but with quiet respect. They were finally standing on their own feet. And I was finally learning to let go without guilt. Some nights, I'd look up at the stars from my porch and think about how growth often happens in silence. It's not loud or dramatic. It's just steady, a quiet commitment made one small choice at a time. And even though I didn't know how the story would end, I could feel that we were moving towards something better. Not perfect. Not easy. But honest. 2 years can feel like a lifetime when you're rebuilding from nothing. But as I look back now, I can see that those years reshaped all of us in ways I never expected. Ryan kept his promise. Slowly, piece by piece, he paid back every dollar he owed. It didn't happen overnight. Sometimes he sent only a few hundred at a time, but he never stopped. He stayed in therapy, too. And somewhere along that journey, he found humility. I saw it in his posture, in the way he spoke, even in the way he listened. He had learned that strength isn't about control, it's about accountability. Jenna surprised me most. She turned her job at the cafe into a small business of her own. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet corner bakery that served the community. She once told me she'd discovered that real success wasn't about status, but about sleeping peacefully at night. That stuck with me. Our relationship didn't turn into a perfect family reunion. There were still distances, still scars that reminded us where we'd come from. But the love between us had changed, it had matured. It was no longer fragile or conditional. It was steady, honest, earned. As for me, I learned to love my solitude, not as loneliness but as freedom. I spent mornings tending to my garden, evenings reading by the window, and weekends volunteering at the same animal shelter my late husband's uncle had once supported. It felt right somehow, like life had come full circle, mending what had been broken long before. Sometimes Ryan would stop by with groceries or a cup of coffee. Small gestures that meant more than grand apologies ever could. We didn't need to say much anymore. Our silence had become gentle instead of cold. One afternoon, he told me he'd finally finished paying everyone back. I remember smiling. Not out of pride, but out of peace. He had finally become the man I once prayed. He'd be the kind who could stand on his own without stepping on others to do it. And as I stood by my window that night, looking out over the garden, I realized what true wealth really meant. It wasn't about lottery winnings or houses or possessions. It was about knowing your worth, setting your boundaries, and still choosing love even when it demands strength. The money had given me comfort. Yes, but the boundaries, the lessons, and the forgiveness had given me freedom. If my story teaches anything, it's this: love without self-respect will break you, but love with boundaries, it rebuilds you. So wherever you are, whatever bridges you're trying to mend, start by standing firm in who you are. Because real healing doesn't begin with getting back what you lost. It begins with reclaiming yourself.